thank you very much for joining us for this third session of our seminar on education in time of environmental crisis. This session is going to be in English today, and I'm really pleased to have Anka and Maria today. I think I told you about them already in a previous seminar because I met them in a training session in Brussels a few weeks ago, and they're both very involved into education, climate change, and lifelong education because it's not only for children. Yesterday, we had a wonderful session with teenagers, with middle school students, and Anka was saying she felt was the most demanding audience, and we are looking very much forward to going on today with this session. Unlike last time, where it was very theoretical and we had a theoretical framework about what kind of education and what are the purposes of education with Pierre-Henri Dodart, this session is going to be a bit more practical, and you're going to share also what you're doing in your workshops. And I must say that the workshop we did in Brussels, for me, was a kind of illustration of the subtitle of my seminar, because it was both knowledge, because you shared a lot of information, but also emotions. And myself at some point even got overwhelmed with thinking about what was going on, and engagement. And at the end of the seminar, we all took decision for actions that we were going, even small actions that we were going to implement in our lives and daily life in our respective environments. It was a European project with people from all over Europe, so it was really, really nice. And I'm very happy to be able to go on sharing these both knowledge, emotions, and hopefully engagement as well during this seminar. So I immediately let you speak and maybe introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anka. I come from Belgrade, Serbia. I work for an organization called the Environment and Human Rights Academy. And together with Maria from News Decoder, we're working on a project that's called Empowering Youth Through Environmental Storytelling, which combines climate change and environmental education with journalism.
Hello, everyone. I'm Maria, originally from the United States, but based here in Paris.
Okay, so to begin this session, we prepared the little icebreaker to get your mind set in some topics that we're going to be speaking about today. I'm going to paste the Miro board. I don't know if you have used the Miro board tool before, but it's quite straightforward and easy. If you enter this link, it will take you to some cartoons. Environmental issues are quite difficult to grasp, so sometimes it's better if we deal with them with a bit of humor. Once you go inside the Miro board, and for you guys in the room, maybe you can just do it. You can also do it online. I don't know if you have access to the Zoom link, or you can just do it on pieces of paper. There's 4 cartoons on different topics that we'll touch upon today. So I'll just give you a few minutes to look at the cartoons, read them, and then post either on the sticky notes or for people in the room on pieces of paper what kind of thoughts these cartoons trigger or emotions. And if you resonate with something that someone has put on the board, you can put a little star next to it. So I'll just give you a few minutes to do that, and then we can read out some comments together. Okay, so we have some great comments coming in. For the first cartoon, we can see emergency and technocratic and adaptive behaviors. So kind of in response to these 2 alien-looking like people reading the ways to adapt to a burning planet. The next one, which is about different knowledge systems and why they're important. We can see anger, cultural imperialism, colonial mentalities. Then systems thinking, exactly. We can see a comment about the importance of complexity and interconnection of issues. Exactly, simplification often does more harm than good. And maybe the one I personally find the funniest, the one about why trees should care about economics. We can see the need for representation of the voiceless non-human citizens. So kind of interspecies conversations that we could try and have. Well, thank you. And I hope you like this little icebreaker and that it got you in a good mindset to kick off the seminar. Pascal, should I share my screen on this or should we share it there?
You can.
So while we're setting up, you guys in the room and online, tell me how much you know about climate justice. Is this something that you've discussed before or a concept you got already introduced to?
It's a reflection about the fact that we are not all equal in the responsibility of climate change, and so the responsibility of who is gonna do the most efforts.
Exactly. So it's about the different kind of responsibility for CO2 emissions and vulnerability, and who should be kind of the head actor in dealing with the climate crisis. So I think this also reflects kind of the conversations about climate injustice, is that the climate crisis is not just something that is of concern for natural scientists, but it is also a social justice crisis. So it has a lot to do with kind of inequality and systemic also inequalities for the responsibility, but both vulnerability for the climate crisis. Can you change the slide? So, sorry, what's your name?
Oh,
Just as Or said, climate injustice is about the different responsibilities and vulnerabilities to climate change. I imagine a lot of you already know about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But just quickly to say what these maps represent. So the one on the far left about responsibility, that shows CO2 emissions per capita according to countries. When it's darker red, that means that there's higher CO2 emissions. And we can see that the wealthiest countries have the higher responsibility for the climate crisis, while at the same time they are the least vulnerable, which we can see on the map in the middle. So with the middle map, if it's colored in red, that means very high vulnerability to climate change, while the green, yellowish colors represent lower vulnerability. And I think this inequality also becomes even more obvious when we look at historical emissions. So when kind of the Industrial Revolution happened, it is countries that are the wealthiest now and that have the most resources to adapt to climate change that have had the highest responsibility. And of course, this is also tied to issues of colonization and resource extraction that happened during colonization, and it also reflects into kind of who has power and in voices in decision-making arenas such as COP30, which is happening now in Brazil. At the end, we'll also reflect a bit on that. But the point here is just to say that the history also shapes very much power and inequality today. So this is kind of one dimension of climate justice, is at the global scale. But if we zoom in a bit more to like a city level, for example, we can see inequalities as well. So we can see inequalities between, again, responsibility and vulnerability. So the richest 10% of the population is responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions, while the bottom, so the poorest 50% is only responsible for 8% of the emissions. So we can see a huge disparity here in terms of how much your wealth correlates to CO2 emissions. And we can see it also with vulnerability to climate change. So on the image of the right, you can see a neighborhood in Mumbai, India, and you can see how much hotter it is during a heat wave in a neighborhood that is less well off compared to a richer neighborhood. So these inequalities exist at smaller scales as well. And then we can also think about what resources they have on a household level to adapt. So houses on the right, not only is it 6 degrees cooler, but they probably have air conditioning and other ways to adapt to a heat wave. Then we also have, could you discuss? Yeah. We also have climate injustices when we think about things like gender and ethnicity. So when economic power intersects with other inequalities, such as gender and ethnicity, we can see climate injustices unfold here as well. So here I just put 2 examples, which is the fact that women have higher mortality during natural disasters. Sometimes this is because they don't have access to services as much as males do. Sometimes it is because they are caretakers within their families. So when they have to evacuate, they also have to take care of children or the elderly. And then again, the example of indigenous peoples who have their livelihoods are very much connected to the environment, which means they get directly impacted when natural disasters do happen, such as when a drought happens and they depend directly on land for kind of income and livelihoods. But also they, in general, indigenous people are exposed to extreme poverty, discrimination, and marginalization. Another form of injustice manifests on timescales. So generational injustice. And here we're speaking about how young people who are born today, yesterday, in more recent years will be the ones feeling the highest effects of climate change. And I think this visualization on the left shows it really well. I don't know if you've heard of climate stripes. It's a website, and you can find your own city wherever you're from, and it kind of shows how much warmer it is in recent years compared to the average between 1960 and between the 60s and 80s. And Vasco Manuel made this to represent how much his kid will be exposed to increased temperatures compared to him, compared to his father, and compared to his grandfather. And this injustice, next slide, has been recognized on a global level. So with institutions such as the UN, at the EU level, and there's been calls when we transition from fossil fuel-based energy system to a renewable energy based system, that this has to be done in a just way. So it means that no people should be left behind while this transition happens. But it also means that we shouldn't replicate the systemic inequalities that exist today. Is this happening? Well, not really, so to say. Within academia, there has been discussions about green extractivism. So if you're interested in this topic, you can look this term up. So basically, extractivism refers to when in companies or countries extract resources at a very fast pace and at large scales. But also within extractivism, what defines it is that these resources are taken out of the place where they're extracted, processed elsewhere, and that people who benefit from this extraction is not the people who feel the socio-environmental impacts of the extraction of the resources. We can see this throughout colonization, but we can also see it happening today, just labeled as green. So the main way this green extractivism manifests today is tied to the renewable energy transition, because the renewable energy transition is very mineral intensive. So it requires the so-called critical minerals, such as nickel, cobalt, lithium, which we need to produce the technology that we need for the renewable energy transition. The thing is that the places where these resources are mined are the already marginalized and poor countries or regions within countries. This happens for a variety of reasons. It's because land is cheaper where marginalized people live, so it's more profitable for companies, and it's also because their voices are silenced when they try to oppose such activities. So it is projected that the demand for these minerals will increase by 40% by 2040. And this is going to have a large impact in, for example, Congo, and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, where the lithium triangle is, which is Chile, Argentina, and Peru, and also in other places. For example, in Australia, which is an affluent country, mining usually happens where indigenous people live and peasants. So yeah, if you're interested in this concept, you can look up green extractivism, and there's a lot of literature about it and a lot of examples around the world. So this brings me to Pascal. Systems change, because what we can see now is that climate action is too slow, or it has very low impact. So based on current policies that we have today, we are projected to reach 2.7 degrees warming by 2100, which I guess you'll know is way above what was agreed in the Paris Agreement of aiming for 1.5 and not surpassing 2 degrees Celsius warming. And we can also see that systemic inequalities are being replicated under the green transition as it's happening today. So it's kind of these tools that we're trying to use now that fit into the current system are only replicating the issues because it's what our system has currently been built on. That kind of brings us to why we need some more deeper change, so to say. And I saw already that someone put a sticky note when there was that cartoon of fixing schools, and the man saying to the woman that hers is messy, and her replying that his lacks reality. So our reality is very messy and very complex. And systems thinking is a way to think about it in a messy, in a purposefully messy way, but that brings a better representation of reality. So when we look at a system, through systems thinking, we are also looking at the relationships and feedback loops and patterns between different parts of the system. This iceberg model represents it very well, because when we see an event, it is only a part of everything that preceded that event and the reason why that event occurred. So there's different patterns of behavior, the system structure impacts it, and also the mental models. This is taken from the Meadows website. So Donna Meadows is one of the key systems thinkers, and on her website you can also find a lot of resources about systems thinking. What brings us hope when speaking about systems change is these leverage points. So leverage points are places within a system where a small change can trigger bigger transformations. So here on the slide, you can see some examples of leverage points. Some are stronger, some are weaker. So rules are, for example, leverage points, but they're weaker leverage points. Because you can change a rule or a law in a system, but if the goals and mindsets, which are deeper leverage points, stay the same, people might try to find ways to work around the rules. So yes, rules and policies and laws can change things, but they can bring kind of marginal change if the goals and mindsets or paradigms of the system don't change as well. So for example, the goal of our economic system is to grow, and its priority will never be human and ecological well-being. And until that changes, we can only make marginal changes within the system. But one of the deep leverage points is education, because education impacts the way we see the world, the way we see our relationship with nature. And when the mindsets and relationships and the way we see the world around us change, that's when we're speaking about how we can bring actual change. Here I put an example of how I think something that could bring systems change, and it's intercultural universities. So in Mexico, these intercultural universities are emerging. I think there's 12 or 15 currently there. And these universities recognize that indigenous knowledge and kind of local ecological knowledge has been suppressed, but that it also holds very valuable information on how we can both adapt to climate change, but also how we can relate differently to the natural world. These intercultural universities bring wise elders, for example, to classes. So it's not only people with really strong academic background that come and teach, but also people who have this generational and experiential knowledge. It also aims to provide access to higher education for Indigenous youth, because that is a big issue, that Indigenous youth doesn't have easy access to universities. And it uses bilingual teaching because Indigenous languages are also at the threat of being lost. And these languages hold so much knowledge about the natural environment. So it really is a big loss, I think, globally. Kind of every language that is being lost. And what is great is that Indigenous people who go to these universities, they act as they stand in between their communities and then governments or NGOs or international institutions. So they kind of act as brokers and bridge these two. These intercultural universities use the philosophy of two-eyed seeing, which you can see on the right. And that is the concept that with one eye, we should look with Western science or Western knowledge, and with the other eye, we should look with Indigenous knowledge. And I also find it really nice that the more we find out with these Western scientific tools, the more we see that kind of some things that Indigenous knowledge or that local knowledge has been saying for ages, and we might have dismissed 20 years ago, now it's proven. So I don't know if you've heard about how like trees communicate through mycorrhizal networks, for example. So now science has proven that trees can basically communicate and speak to each other. And I think if you said that 20 years ago, people would dismiss you until you're a hippie. And now we have actual proof that this is happening. And it's done through these kind of fungal signals. And what's really fascinating with this as well is they have these huge networks in the soil. And scientists didn't know how trees could communicate with that speed. So they thought they would release chemical signals, and through these fungal networks that are connecting trees underneath the soil, that it was through chemical signals, but this was too slow. And then they realized that it's actually through kind of electric signals. So they jump in between. And this is also observed in mammal brains. So it's the same technique in the mammal brains and how trees communicate, which is really, really fascinating.
Do you have any resources or any website or paper or things about that? I think it's of interest for students.
Yeah, I can send a really nice book about this, and also about Indigenous knowledge. There's this book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and the book about fungi. Fantastic Fungi is the documentary, and then the book is, I forgot the name, but I'll send it to you if you want.
Yeah, somebody online saying, yes, please.
Okay. And then how much more time do I have?
We have in total 2 hours, so depending on.
I also just wanted to speak a bit about, I mean, this was already mentioned, but there is a great lack of Indigenous and local knowledge. And I think a lot of us here come from Europe, but traditional ecological knowledge exists in Europe as well. And it's important to listen to it because I think there's been a lot of recognition about the importance of this knowledge. But when we go to decision-making arena, it is true that the environmental field kind of remains underpinned mostly by Western scientific knowledge, and that this traditional knowledge remains marginalized. But climate change science and also conservation science really needs this knowledge co-creation that happens when different knowledge systems are bridged. And then we can ask ourselves of how we can give voice to these different knowledge systems. There's a lot of concepts out there that can help us to do this. So, for example, here with the unraveling, meshing, and then raveling, that is a framework by Galafasia Al. At the end of this presentation, there's also a lot of references if you want to return to some of these concepts that are mentioned. But all what these frameworks stress, like the framework of ethical space, of two-eyed seeing, of unraveling, is that we really need to reflect on ourselves when we are trying to bridge different knowledge systems. Because, can you change the slide, please? One of the biggest challenges when we bridge traditional and Western knowledge is exactly this lack of reflection on the epistemological arena and understanding. So Western science aims to be objective, but if you've done ever philosophy of science, you know that this is only partially true. As a researcher, you have some pre-assumptions about the world that came depending on where you grew up, who was your teacher, and so on. So the questions, let's start from the questions that we ask. All that is underpinned by who we are as people. And we need to reflect on this when we kind of do research. So when you do your master's research, depending on what you'll do, but you'll probably do, like, for example, a positionality statement. So reflecting who you are in relation to what you are researching. And this is not done. I believe really that within natural sciences, this has to be done, because although natural sciences aim to be objective, I think this can also help natural sciences flourish and be more useful. Another issue is the power inequalities, colonial histories, and lack of trust. And that a lot of the time, because the way academia is done, because of the way we publish articles, what are the standards, is that traditional knowledge systems have to conform to Western standards, which results in insufficient and superficial collaboration and often knowledge extraction. So you kind of go somewhere, you do a lot of interviews, you find out what you want, you kind of leave, and you do with the knowledge you created whatever you want, which I'd say is kind of so-called helicopter science and something that we should be aware of and try to avoid. One tool that can help with bridging different knowledge systems is art-based methods. Art-based methods are part of what's more broadly called sometimes participatory action research. And within art-based methods, art can be used at any stage of the research. So things like photography, craft, poems, storytelling, theater are used either as a method to research or within kind of some parts of the research. So it can be data generation, analysis, interpretation, or at the end, representation of results, which I think is kind of where art is mostly used, but it can also be very useful within data generation as well. Just to make this a bit more graspable, I've included an example. So my academic background is more from biodiversity conservation. So this is an example of using a tool called photo voice, which is when cameras and storytelling are combined as a research method. This paper, this research was done in Algoa Bay in South Africa, and cameras were given to traditional and indigenous communities to ask them about marine conservation management in their area. What came as a result, what findings is a sense of exclusion, and that there was lack of access to spiritual, cultural, and recreational spaces. So it was kind of shown that this conservation was the so-called fortress conservation. So you exclude people from the natural environment, even though they have been using these spaces for generations and are very much part of the socio-ecological ecosystem. What was really nice is that this tool also helped people remember the past and imagine more inclusive ocean management. And as part of this research, what was done is also an exhibition with these photographs and stories that the co-researchers produced. People who managed the marine park were invited to the meeting, as well as local authorities. So photo voice can be also a very powerful advocacy tool and not just a research method. Another example is, so this was done on Arab Island in the Torres Strait region. And the aim of this research was to see how local elders but also other members of the local community, have noticed climate change unfold, but also what traditional ways they use to tell seasons. And this was from, for example, migration of birds, arrival of logs in a certain period of year from the ocean, looking at star constellations. So there's a lot of ways that people who are connected to the environment, and who have been generationally passing on this knowledge, can tell changes. And this is really useful within climate research because it can help us understand how the climate is changing, but it also is very useful when thinking about how we can adapt to climate change. So, for example, these seasonal patterns and signals that people can read the environment can help with early warning systems, for example, when we're speaking about climate adaptation. And what was really nice with this research is that this mural, when it was created, it was painted in a local school, to kind of try and bring this indigenous knowledge closer to younger generations. You can see here also that the Western calendar was included, and that was done at the request of elders because this is the calendar that they use at their local schools. And here you can have, at the bottom, there's a quote from an elder reflecting on why we must have a balance with indigenous and scientific knowledge. Here on the next slide, there is just a few more examples of art-based methods being used. So this can be conservation theater, or more broadly, there's theater of the oppressed, where people make plays about the issues within their local communities and how they can communicate them, participatory video making, how visual arts are being used, storytelling and art installations. So this is just a lot of examples. There's, again, references at the slide if this is of interest. And it would feel weird not to mention COP30 now, since we're speaking about equity. So there's been a lot of protests on the current COP that's happening in Belém in Brazil. This, I believe, is kind of symbolic that the COP is happening in the Amazon rainforest, but the Amazon rainforest is, as we speak, still exposed to various forms of extraction. There's been a lot of protests because of this, and also because even though this is the highest number where indigenous people are presented at any COP, the actual access to the decision-making arenas, only 14% of all the indigenous people who are attending the COP have access to the rooms where decisions are made, because there's different plenaries, there's some that are open, but again, decisions are kind of made behind closed doors. One of the quotes from the protests is that, I'm just going to read it out. For us, it's a moment of revolt, of indignation. We don't eat money. We want our territory free. But the business of oil exploration, mineral extraction, and logging continues. So this is one indigenous leader, and maybe you've seen videos of the protests where they marched in to COP. What has happened after this, which is great, is like two kind of happy news, not to keep it all doom and gloom, is that the government of Colombia announced that the entire Amazon biome within their territories is off limits to new mining and oil extraction. And that since the protest, Brazil has recognized 10 new indigenous lands, which means that indigenous people now have the legal right also to protect and manage their lands. And in general, indigenous peoples are the highest custodians of biodiversity. And again, to reflect in the concept, I mean, I'm from Serbia, so I kind of know from there, but I also I'm starting some research within the Old Mountain in Serbia, speaking to pastoralists and their traditional knowledge and their interconnection with the environment, because, for example, they shape the landscape very much with their herding activities. So just again to reflect that you don't have to go far away to find traditional knowledge and to kind of elevate these marginalized voices. And just a slide to again reflect on the strengths of art-based methods. They're really good at adjusting power inequalities because they art helps us reflect on these epistemological arenas, and it kind of equals out the playing field. When you make art together, this high up scientist with his nose high might be able to kind of understand some things better by also allowing for emotional responses, which I also think is really important if you work with people who may have an emotional reaction about your research topic, it's very important to allow this space for emotions. And it can also overcome some language or communication barriers. And also it supports strengths of indigenous communities, because a lot of the knowledge, the way that they surpass knowledge, is done through art-based methods. And it has potential to decolonize participatory research.
Can I just ask one question, Anka? Do you have yourself experience with art-based research or activities?
So I've done some participatory mapping, which kind of is the map that ended as a result, I'd say was art in a way, but it was about mapping coastal values. So my friend was kind of like, I was helping him, and it was in Scotland, and he was mapping, looking for restoration sites, but also seeing that it kind of is okay with the local community, so seeing how they use the coast. So and just the last concluding slide is that we need to diversify our methods, research, and solutions. We can see that the current solutions are not doing an amazing job with dealing with the climate and environmental crisis. So I think there's a lot of potential to kind of go outside these echo chambers, allow new voices to enter, which can bring us a lot more innovative solutions. So we need alternative ways of knowing and doing to be able to deal with the current crisis. And we can definitely turn to traditional, ecological, and experiential knowledge when we're looking for this. Just to stress again that the social justice and environmental issues are interlinked when we look at the root causes of both, and that you as master students in this room can contribute very much on whose voices are being heard in academia and maybe later in policy and practice. And that's it. Then it's just reference slide. I mean, there is one more slide as part of work that we do within the Environment and Human Rights Academy. So we have some courses on biodiversity and climate change and storytelling, if it's of interest to anyone. That speaks a lot about kind of these justice aspects are very central to the kind of educational materials we make.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anka. It's fascinating. Do you have any questions? Just a quick comment, because I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's currently just a call from the CNRS about ocean and climate, and one of the axes happens to be connecting art and sciences. So what you're saying, I think, is really powerful, because it's also something that can be included in some official project, and it's recognized by the institution. So like with the trees speaking to each other, I don't think it's something that was very easy to make 10 or 20 years ago, but now it's even in official calls. Any questions online or any questions in the room?
If you want to ask in French, someone can translate.
In English.
Or in French.
Je suis japonais, donc ça me fait vraiment penser de la situation japonaise. En fait, par rapport en France, en Europe, le Japon, l'éducation, c'est pas encore comme le niveau de, on n'est pas, les enfants ne sont pas encore intéressés à la question environnementale, la sociale, etc. Donc ça me fait vraiment penser comment éduquer les élèves japonais. Et en fait, dans le mouvement social au Japon, les gens ont toujours le sentiment de peur pour le manifestation, dans la rue, etc. Et donc, pour ça que j'aimerais bien savoir comment dire, parce que le changement climatique, c'est assez sérieux. Et aussi, il faut faire quelque chose tout de suite. On n'a pas assez de temps pour le changement climatique. Mais en même temps, il faut avoir un peu le sentiment de positif pour concerner ce genre de problèmes sociaux. Donc, comment vous faites quelque chose, par exemple, éduquer les enfants et aussi manifeste ce sentiment opposite de peur et aussi de joie, comment comme équivalence entre les deux? J'aimerais bien savoir comme dans la pratique. c'est deux sentiments, de la peur et de la joie. Donc, participation.
Do you want to translate, Maria? So general translation, so he's coming from Japan, and in Japan, there's young people have fear
Yeah.
of in protesting. So there's looking for, if I summarize, solutions or approaches for working with young people to overcome the fear, but also bringing joy, to celebrate the joie. And because the climate crisis is obviously a very urgent problem, needs to be resolved quickly, but it's a bit slow to come. Like these sort of solutions are slow to come. Yeah, that's what, yeah.
I think we can go back to the kind of leverage tipping points, because I think they are slow to come, but I think often something happens and then big change, like change happens more quickly. And we've seen that with kind of women's rights movements or abolition of slavery, for example. It's kind of like something happened and then change, I mean, somewhat quicker. So I'm kind of hoping for that, but I don't know. And I think in terms of protesting and fear, I think there's a lot of ways you can protest that don't necessarily have to mean you have to go out on the streets. Like we spoke about artivism yesterday, which is protesting through art. I think like activism on social media is really big now. That is another way, like just speaking to people around you, I think can also bring a lot of change.
So many type of manifestation movements.
Yeah.
But the Japanese people don't know the reality of manifestation. Je pense que parce que quand je suis venu en France, la manifestation c'est assez, comment dire, très sympa. Et aussi les gens parlent très positivement, émotionnellement. Donc c'était vraiment pas du tout l'image médiatisée au Japon. Donc c'est vraiment l'image, c'est vraiment contraire. Comme les gens, on est dans la rue et on toujours en colère. Et aussi comment dire. Donc c'est vraiment l'image, c'est vraiment assez important. Et on n'a pas assez de choix. On n'est pas assez de types de manifestations. Donc c'est vraiment important de diversifier la manière. Ça dépend des gens, ça dépend des régions, ça dépend des pays. Donc
So one thing from that, which I think is true in a lot of places, is when you come to protests here in France or on the streets, there's often people are celebrating, or it is kind of joyful, but the images that are broadcast, people seem very angry, and it seems like maybe violent, and so there's this disconnect between what's actually happening in a protest in the manifestation versus what maybe the media is showing. I think that happens maybe in Japan, but also in other countries. When you see something happening in another country, it seems often worse than it is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in Serbia, we had big protests now, student-led protests, where a student came and, I mean, I could, if I get into this, it'll last half an hour. But basically, it was like that slogan, corruption kills. This was a direct consequence. So a train station that was reconstructed, the canopy collapsed and killed 16 people 6 months after it was completely renovated. And this was done because it was done really badly, because the president's cousin did it or something, not experts. And students really rose up, like occupied their university, stopped the higher education system for almost a year. And those protests were sometimes joyful, sometimes not, depending on kind of the levels of danger, because also it's different to protest in France, it's different to protest, like the levels of danger can be very different depending on where you are. So it is, I don't know.
There's a question online.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this. It was such a wonderful presentation.
Yeah,
Very
maybe.
interesting.
Sorry, we couldn't hear you, but now we can, I think.
Oh, okay. I have lots of questions, but I'll try and be selective. I would love to hear more about the workshops that you run. Apparently you did something yesterday, but I didn't quite understand what it was. But if that's not relevant to this discussion, because I'm just out of the loop, I can maybe ask Pascal about it later. But yeah, I'd love to hear more about the kind of groundwork, like ground level work that you do with young people, and which young people and in what context and how it works and stuff like that. But perhaps that's a conversation for another context. I'll let you decide. more about your presentation, I have two questions. When we talk about the integration between of Indigenous culture into climate education, for example, and it's several times you said we don't need to go that far to find that Indigenous culture and that Indigenous knowledge that we can valorize in the school system. I was recently at a day for education and climate that was run by the European Commission. I was in a panel about this, and they and when I asked this same question, which Indigenous culture for children growing up in France, for example, in rich Western countries, because of course, as you mentioned, there is a risk of kind of exploitation, or at best maybe kind of stereotyping. I mean, I think it could be done well. I mean, maybe the answer is actually that we need to integrate anthropology into primary schools to open up and decolonize sort of worldviews at a very early age. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what kinds of Indigenous culture you see as being relevant, like you talked about an example in Serbia, but to say children growing up in France. One of the examples that one of the speakers gave the other day was like looking to say our grandparents, like and their traditional practices around sort of accidental sustainability. So things like, you know, preserving, having a vegetable garden, preserving their you know, their produce, and just having a kind of a frugal and accidentally frugal lifestyle. And that is an answer that I find challenging, because when you see, for example, that the association of those kind of practices with like intensive pesticide use, for example, in France, it's like if we look to the generation of our grandparents who had these vegetable gardens, on one hand, that's great, but it's also associated with very intensive use of things and a kind of an exploitative relationship to the land that is maybe quite different from the Indigenous knowledge that we're talking about, for example, in a North American context, when we're talking about like braiding sweetgrass, for example. You know, it's different relationships to the land. So what kind of Indigenous or traditional knowledge, and for what purposes and for who, I guess, that's the first question. And then the other question is about storytelling. What kind of storying is, and what would be the role of fiction and climate fiction, for example, in opening up that storytelling within climate education?
Okay, I think first question about what we do. So yesterday we were at the lab school. We work with high school kids a lot, but I think maybe we can connect at a different moment, not to.
Yeah, I can put you in touch.
Yeah, so I can tell you more about it.
That would be great.
Within kind of the traditional knowledge in Europe, I think there's space for it in a lot of ways. And of course, what you said is we shouldn't romanticize it. And I think a lot of places where it comes from, of these maybe going out to the countryside and stuff. Again, I can't really speak for France. I think maybe someone else in the room can speak for France much better. I can again turn to examples in Serbia, but people who hold this knowledge are often very poor, for example, and we shouldn't romanticize this traditional ecological knowledge when we speak about Europe, and even more when we speak about kind of Indigenous knowledge in the global South. And it is very challenging to bridge it in ways with scientific knowledge, because it just relies on so many different ways of seeing the world. And I think to truly do that, we have to change some ways that we do things in academia. But I think there's space for it in primary education, honestly. Like, I mean, kids now can tell more brands than plants. So bringing someone who knows plants really well and who knows local plants and who can help people later on preserve like local varieties of fruits and vegetables and cattle and so on. Like, I think this is something that kids can be taught in primary school. Primary to secondary to university, of course. So I kind of think there's lots of spaces where this can be brought in. And then when it reaches the university level, hopefully it can also be translated into some kind of policy recommendations. So bringing it into kind of higher decision-making spaces, where we can work towards preserving this kind of, it's also called in research biocultural conservation. So this idea that culture and biodiversity are both interlinked, and there's the same root causes that cause the loss of culture and the loss of kind of biodiversity, and that by working to protect the culture, we can also protect the biodiversity. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Storytelling is a nice transition.
Oh yeah, storytelling. I think Maria can come in here.
So we'll get into that, I think, more in the next presentation.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, we're setting it up well.
Oh,
Yeah. Although we won't be talking as much about fiction, but I think fiction is also in film are wonderful entry points into tackling some of these bigger issues in a more accessible way, even to the question in the room, to how to galvanize young people to, well, not just even action, but just get them out of a inertia or overwhelm or.
I think that's a great question to transition to the next presentation. Ideal.
If there's anyone that came in late, just to introduce, I'm Maria Krasinski from News Decoder, and to give a bit more background maybe about this project and why we're here. So News Decoder has partnered with Terra on this project called Empowering Youth Through Environmental Storytelling, or EYES, and it's under this framework that we came to work with the lab school, that we came to do these teacher trainings, and really combining the specialties of our organizations to help advance climate change education, to help teachers bring climate change education into their schools in a more robust way, and give young people an entry point into how they can take action. Often climate change education in schools is limited to sort of surface level individual actions, a recycling program or reusing. So I'm gonna go into sort of the storytelling side of the project EYES and kind of start out with how we work with young people. As Anka said, we're mostly working with high school students, although we also work with some younger students and some university level and beyond as well. And why we think storytelling is an effective tool for learning about engaging with climate change. And when I say storytelling here, we're primarily talking about journalistic storytelling. News Decoder we're a news site and a global education platform for young people to learn journalistic skills and tools and techniques as an entry point into exploring these big global issues, climate change, of course, being one of them. Working with young people on journalism, where we're often receiving pitches, I think is also a really interesting insight into what is weighing on the mind of young people, because they're pitching stories that they are interested in, that they care about, and they want to learn more about. And I would say climate change and mental health are the top two topics we see coming from young people. So we know that this is weighing on them. This is just a little bit about News Decoder. So we're not a journalism school. Our goal is not to train the next generation of journalists and reporters, although if students go that way, that's great. But it's really, again, about helping young people find an avenue into being an active global citizen and really participating in the dialogue and giving them a platform and a space for their voices to be heard and be on the level of an expert. And so we really believe in their lived experience, that they have a lot to contribute and explore to the dialogue. So our mission, our work is founded on these sort of principles of student inquiry. So it's student-led. We are not telling young people what to think. Within the EYES curriculum, we have several modules, and Anka went into several kind of the big picture. We have climate justice, kind of climate 101, biodiversity. So it's setting up the science, setting up the ideas. Here's what's happening in the world. But then we want to give space for young people to come in with their questions, like what of that stuck with you? What do you want to continue to explore? And it's a space to really exercise that kind of critical thinking by doing. So we're very much about learning by doing, getting out there, talking to people, being a journalist. And this is a snapshot of some of the work that our students have done. So actually, kind of to the question in the room about with manifestation and young people, we train young people also on, well, put on your reporter's hat, put on a journalist hat. If you're going to go to a protest, talk to people, find out why they're there, take photos, take video, create multimedia pieces. So you can kind of see just some of the different topics that have come up. We talked a little bit about language. So within the context of climate change, maybe you're not even thinking, we talk about land disappearing, animal species disappearing, but also languages are under threat because of climate change. So this was a student in India who went kind of in her surrounding community and look, there are dozens and dozens of languages and which ones are being affected and sort of dying out as a result of climate change. We encourage young people to start with where they are, kind of this idea that you are an expert in your own experience, and then kind of connect those issues to somewhere else in the world. Because if you're experiencing something, if you're seeing something, it's very likely that someone else in the world has had a similar experience. So kind of in this top section, a student wrote about a prank at their school where the students just thought they were just having fun, and they kind of threw toilet paper all over the campus, and they kind of ended up causing some real destruction to the biodiversity, in the trees. They disrupted birds' nests. And so it just started with something he saw happen in his school and the consequences thereof, which led him to exploring, our campus actually sits in this sort of migration zone, and the impacts that their silly actions he thought were having. So as an entry point into becoming more aware of just where they live. And to one of the questions in the room about how we had one of our correspondents write about how fiction helps us explore climate change, and to Anka's point, how art and non-scientific data, which can sometimes be a bit overwhelming to consume and to interpret, is really more effective in kind of motivating people. Think of that. There was a Netflix film, Don't Look Up, that was the talk of everyone for a long time, and probably more talked about than the latest IPCC report. So as we talked about, climate change, when you're talking about these scientific reports or even the news media, you're hearing this kind of complex or data heavy research. You maybe don't have familiarity with all the terms that might be in a more academic leaning paper. It can be emotionally overwhelming, as I think we've all experienced. Like, it feels like, what do we do? It instills fear. You feel kind of paralyzed. And in the school context, it's often taught in isolation. So it might be your environmental studies class or a science class, but you're not talking about climate change perhaps in English. How can fiction and poetry be an avenue into talking about climate change? So you're learning sort of in silos, and not everyone is having the same information. And so that's where storytelling comes in. And I like this quote that stories are data with a soul. So we need the data, we need the research, we need the scientists. But within all that data is based on people and real experiences, and it has a ripple effect. And so how do you get to the soul of what those numbers are? And there's, I think, a nice way to think about storytellers or journalists is, well, with Anka's presentation too, we were hearing about scientists, you're hearing about policymakers and governments and laws, you're hearing about artists, you're hearing about activists. And those communities are often not speaking to one another. Scientists are in their lane, in their lab, sharing their data with their peers. Policymakers and governments are over here. And, sometimes maybe the government talks to the scientists, or the artists protest against government, but they're not all speaking to each other and sharing what they're doing and what they're learning. And that's where storytellers and journalists come in, because they're talking to everybody. They're trying to get the different perspectives from all of these different groups and communities that are involved around an issue to find the soul, I guess, of what is really going on in this issue. And thus, with storytelling, you can give meaning to that data. When you go out and talk to people with the lived experience of a climate crisis or a disaster, you can connect emotionally. So lead with telling a personal story as an entry point into getting into the larger question, the larger issues, going out to a protest and finding out why somebody is there. Did they have a family that was displaced because of a climate policy or and then it helps us see the bigger picture, which gets into the systems thinking. When you start to see how education and policy and the economy and business decisions are all interconnected. Going back to the comic, it's not just fix the schools and it'll all be solved. Like, no, it needs to happen at multiple levels, and stories are entry point into that. This is sort of a snapshot of how we work. I think breaking things down into practical, actionable steps is how we function. And so we take this journalistic process, but we think it can be applied to really any kind of story, which as researchers, I'm sure you're all used to working with, well, what's your question? What's your idea? All research starts with being curious about a topic. And so that's where we start with students, but really with anybody is, okay, you want to talk about deforestation. Okay, well, that's huge. How do we narrow it down? Is there something happening where you live? Did you read an article about it? We want to narrow that pitch down to be as specific as possible, because this isn't a master's thesis. This isn't, 10,000 words. This is a 1,000-word article, or maybe a 2 or 3 minute video or podcast. And we want to be as specific as possible. And then we train young people on reporting techniques. How do you go out into the world? How do you talk to people? How do you put together interesting questions? How do you practice active listening? We'll get into some of this. And then bringing all of that together. So once you've gone out and collected the data in the world, you have to assemble that into your first draft. And even if you're doing a podcast, say, you still need a script. So there's always going to be a kind of a written component that supports their story. And the revised part, we publish on our site. We'll be publishing with eyes, working with editors, giving that experience of how do you revise this for the audience you're trying to reach, particularly if you're coming from maybe an academic environment or you're writing policy papers. Well, how do you write this for a general audience where it's actually going to tap into that emotion and motivate people and inform people? So as I was saying, these are some of the journalist's mindset, that we try to instill. And again, this goes well beyond journalism, kind of being curious about the world, asking questions. But what comes with that is also skepticism, and maybe not just accepting the status quo or what is being told, but really wondering, wait, is that all the story? Or what is the motivation behind this company? They're doing, lots of companies do these eco-conscious sort of campaigns, and they like to show how, green that they're becoming, but okay, but you're still a corporation. So go beyond that surface level with curiosity and asking good questions. But then the flip side of that, of course, is to actually listen when you have a chance to talk to somebody, whether it's, a head of a company or a government official or a person on the street at a protest. You might have a list of questions you want to ask, but you want to be actively listening to what they're saying so you can respond to them in the moment. And actually, you might go in with one idea of what the story is, but in fact, there's a whole other story there that you weren't expecting. And so being aware of what your interview is sharing with you versus your own list of questions. When we're talking about journalism or really any kind of media, particularly social media, finding trustworthy sources is key, and verifying those sources. So if somebody does give you a bit of information, doing some fact checking, cross-checking, seeing if anyone else is talking about this or reporting that data, because we're also looking at media literacy from a media production standpoint. So when students are coming to us, they are making media, they're generating new knowledge. And so they themselves are becoming a source by putting stories out there in the world. And so by creating media, by producing media, by seeing all that goes into assembling a story, they're also honing their own critical eye. So when they do read another story or see a video on social media, they have a sense of what they should be looking for, having created it themselves. And clarity. And I think this is a big takeaway, especially if you're trying to move from maybe more research-based or academic-based communications. Well, how do you convey a complex topic in a simple, clear manner? Which doesn't mean dumbing it down, but it's really essentializing the key points. So kind of bringing it together, why we think storytelling is a great tool for climate, in particular journalism. It is connecting the science and emotion. You know, you're putting a human face on that data. You're going beyond maybe just the quick headlines that, you know, I think we're all probably guilty of seeing some headlines but not actually reading the full story. So it kind of connects you more closely with the issue. You're building that systems thinking, you know, by talking to all these different players, these different communities. You know, journalists historically have been kind of like gatekeepers in a way. You know, it's your job to go out, talk to all these different people and present what you learned to your audience. You know, you're not drawing conclusions for them. You're not inserting your own opinion, you know, unless it's very clearly stated that it is an opinion piece, or you're stating your biases up front. But typically it's, well, this is what the politician said, this is what the scientist said, this is what the person on the street said, and then you leave it to the readers to start thinking about how these facets are connected. And because we are really focused on civic engagement and how do we get young people active, so rather than sitting in a classroom kind of studying something abstractly, it's, you know, go out there in the world. And with high school students especially, but maybe master's students as well, we like to say that being a student is sort of your superpower, because if a journalist starts calling a politician or calls a head of a company, hi, I'm a journalist with Le Monde, they usually don't want to talk to you, you know, or they'll have a very canned response, something sort of generic. But if you're a student and you're learning, usually people want to help students. And so you might get that interview, or you get something a little bit more than a professional would get, because they don't think you have an agenda, perhaps. So in the context of you know, research, and you're all studying different aspects of environmental science and climate change, we wanted to dive a little bit into how might you reframe or shift and communicate the work that you're doing to reach that broader audience. And, you know, in addition to high schools, News Decoder has a partnership with university in Toronto, and we work with their public health master's students. They have a global fellowship in journalism. And so these are all students who are subject matter experts in various fields of public health. So some of the students, they're doctors, they're public health researchers, some of them are athletes, you know, all these different facets of public health. But they wanted to add journalism to their skill set, to their toolkit. They can see the value of how being able to communicate their work to a wider audience actually furthers their research rather than kind of staying in a bubble of their particular industry. And as we kind of been saying, you know, people connect with people. There might be some people, I'm actually a little bit one of them. I love numbers, so I will kind of dive into when I see numbers and stats, because I like to see how it comes together. But often that is when it's hand in hand with a human story. And those are the stories that tend to stick with you, not the 40% or 2.2%. You kind of lose the context there. And so we're looking to find that kind of human-centered narrative. You know, how do you take that abstract data and make it more tangible and memorable? And just to put an example here, I think actually maybe the comment before kind of referenced pesticides, but there's a story that has been unfolding in France for a while about a pesticide poisoning and the use of this pesticide in France until the mid-90s, after it had been banned worldwide, basically in the 1970s. So France continued to use this pesticide, and in particular in the overseas territories in Guadeloupe and Martinique, it was allowed to be used even longer, even when all of the harms were known. And so there's a lot of statistics around the ongoing, the health impact of that. Guadeloupe and Martinique have some of the highest rates of prostate cancer. More and more women are finding infertility issues, as you see there. So more than 90% of the population has this pesticide chemical, chlordecone, in their blood. There's a lot of government and policy data on it. But I put this here, you don't have to read it all, but this story doesn't start with naming the biological effects or the law case. It starts with a person. This is the story of Georgina Lambert and what her experience was like growing up, how she saw like how this pesticide was there. She grew up on banana plantations where we went to play. I was outside doing this. So you really get put into the environment. You see, and then later it kind of goes on into her struggles after that. And then it kind of extrapolates out to the science and to the policy issues behind it. So that's just one way to think about how you might frame a story if this is relevant to the research you're doing. And this gets into that emotional aspect, that emotions drive action often more than a simple fact alone. By now, I think we've all heard 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, we need to do something before we reach 2 degrees, but that's so abstract in a lot of ways. So there's been a lot of, different metaphors you can use. I think equating it to like if you are a human, like you have a fever, what happens when you reach a certain level? Your body starts to shut down and break down. So whatever kind of metaphor or analysis might be applicable to your particular work, you might want to think about how do you put something concrete or tangible around that could connect emotionally while still having that accuracy and your research. Again, it's not about dumbing down. So again, it's sort of a tool for navigating complexity. You're giving people a structure for how do you not just read some perhaps alarming material or watch a video and you're so overwhelmed that you kind of actually forget about it and you're like, I'm going to go watch a cute puppy video instead because I can't handle it. But if you structure your story in a way that somebody's story stays with you, you remember it, there's a piece that you can hold on to, that you can feel, like that feeling sits with you more than a number might. And one of the things that when we work with these journalism fellows or even with young people too, is how you can take this topic that you are an expert in, that you're researching and studying, to actually then have, it's not languishing. Well, that's not the, research of course has value within your environment, but if you want it to get out there and reach more people, if you want to have that impact, how can you find a pathway in? So we think it's not dumbing down research, it's actually opening up to invite others in, whether it's policymakers, business leaders, or the general public, but also funders. If you're working in academia, and beyond, you're always looking for people to help fund your research. And I think a key thing to remember, it's also supports accessibility and equity. It's not gatekeeping knowledge. If you're sharing it more widely, if you're putting it in language that people can more easily understand and share. Even just in our name, News Decoder, we're about trying to decode the news, these big complicated topics. Well, how can we put them in kind of explainer articles or find the essential pieces of the story that don't make people kind of, get overwhelmed and drowned out. So yeah, but then there's, of course, multiple ways that issues are represented in media. So we find the stories, and again, this sort of more news media, you do get the human interest stories will get attention. When it comes to climate, the pandas and the whales, and if you have a cute animal, often get kind of more attention, more money, more funding thrown at it than something that's maybe less cute or charismatic solutions. So if there's a new technology or there's a electric cars will solve everything, like those kind of things, the sort of simple level solutions often get coverage, as well as, of course, disaster and conflict dominate headlines when they're occurring. So then what gets left out, well, Anka went deep into this, are more indigenous or traditional perspectives on the issue, you know, not just having the science or the politicians or business getting all the space to have their voices heard. We're not as much hearing from indigenous or marginalized voices. Media moves fast, storytelling moves fast, social media moves fast. So when you have these slow policy changes that are taking years to actually see effects, like those are not getting a regular kind of attention. So how can we retell that story? And again, looking at something systemically, when you have these bite-sized attention spans in a way to get someone's attention and get them engaged with something. If you start to go into, well, then there's the education, and then there's the policy, and then there's this, often that gets left behind in favor of something a little bit easier. And so just here we think, you know, researchers and experts trained in journalism can help fill those gaps, and you have the power and ability to help shape that public discussion and action around the issues that you really care about or that you are studying. And then we just wanted to dive a little bit just into kind of framing, like we all see different headlines, some feel more clickbaity than others. And so I was looking for an example of or how research studies then get portrayed in the media, because this is also, for better or worse, can sometimes be either bring attention to an issue that people hadn't paid attention to before, or kind of be misleading. And I remember this one, it's from a couple of years ago now. It was from the journal Nature, the climate change journal. And the headline is, you know, Greenland ice sheet, climate disequilibrium, and committed sea level rise. So sort of an academic paper with several co-authors. The media coverage around it zoomed in on this idea of zombie ice. Zombie ice will raise sea levels. Zombie ice in Greenland is doomed. You know, catastrophe. So if you look at the words that are used, you know, well, zombie is always going to attract some kind of attention. But you have, yeah, these heavy words, doom, catastrophe. Oh, I didn't put them on here, but those headlines are from, you know, the Associated Press, the BBC, you know, really big media companies. And then I thought it was interesting, the one on the bottom, thicker ice in Greenland glaciers unable to sustain ice sheet edges, came from a site called Kids News. So that was the article addressed to kids. So they weren't talking about zombies, but just a way that how an academic research paper got kind of, they found a bit of a sensational headline in a way to attract attention. And some of those articles, you know, they had a lot of comments on them. So it sort of worked. So whether or not you have zombie ice in your research or not, or something that might capture attention again, but as a way to slide in your research. How are we on time?
We have 20 minutes.
20
and we
minutes
really
left.
have to stop on time because there's another seminar just afterwards.
Okay.
And it's not nice to keep people.
No.
Let's aim for 25 past, so we have time to gather.
Well, just to kind of, we wanted to kind of give an opportunity for you all to think of a story, you know, so what is your story in the research that you're doing, or an issue that you care about? What's a story that you could tell? I'll kind of go through these quickly to sort of set it up, but you could work in groups or on your own. I don't know how it's best, but like if you were to take your own research and reimagine how it was communicated, like what might that look like? Is what you're researching already in the media? If so, how is it portrayed? What voices or perspectives might be missing? And if you were to put a human at the center of it, maybe you already have that. How might that change the narrative? we have some just sort of questions that we can put up to have you think about this, but maybe since we only have about a little less than 20 minutes, oh no, I'm just trying to find the right section here. Giving about maybe 10 minutes of our time just to think on your research.
I don't have this one. I'm finding.
Oh,
yeah,
yep,
that's it.
there it is. So Anka put into the chat for Zoom just some leading questions, which are kind of based on what we have here.
And for people online who are not researchers, of course, there are things you're interested in, so it can be also done from a non-researcher point of view, no problem.
Exactly. And then maybe I just go through the other slides for everyone in the room. So we also, when we're thinking about stories, we want to think about kind of like what is, what's the angle you want to take? Maybe it's just an explainer sort of story, or maybe you're looking at over history, how your issue or the thing that you're interested in has evolved. And we also think about formats. So is it a written article for a newspaper or newsletter? Do you think your work could be best conveyed maybe in a video or a podcast or something multimedia, or something more creative, like leaning into illustration or photography as a way to tell your story? So just take the next 10 minutes and just think through some of these questions.
Will be, then we'll have about 5 minutes to share.
Okay, 7 minutes. We might not get to share all of them.
Just to give you a taste of.
If anyone has any questions, or if it's not clear, basically you're just trying to think of a pitch. So narrowing down an idea for a story.
Well, I have an idea. Well, it's actually because my research is kind of action-based. So I'm planning to make cartographic sessions with the public. So it could be with the children or just random people. And the thing is that I'm using the tool of sensitive cartography. And so it's deeply connected to emotions and how you feel towards your environment. And I think it's my biggest difficulty, that I'm not so sure that the people I will see would be really connected to how they feel the things that are around them. And so I feel like I'm going to ask something that just doesn't touch them.
Sort of kind of goes over their head, or maybe isn't something they've considered before.
Well, something that they don't really care about. They are just being there, and that's all. Like, they don't care about how they feel about the things around them. And
I think, can you give me an example maybe of like what?
I'm working on the link between like your identification to the place where you live, and the fact that you get mobilized for environment. And it's focused on neighborhoods that are close to, I don't know if you know the south of France, like near Marseille, which is a really big city. You have a national park, which is kind of extraordinary. It's extraordinary to have like natural place next to a huge city. And so there are some neighborhoods that are really stick to the park, and I'm working on these neighborhoods. And so I want to ask them to make cartographies of their neighborhoods and see how environment comes into the way they see it. But I'm not so sure that it will appear.
I think in that case, no, I love that project. I think that would be very cool. It's starting at a starting point that's relevant to them, something that they almost already know the answer to. So rather than it's well, how does the national park influence your life? It's like, well, what do you do in your daily life? Where are you going? If you're mapping these places, try to shorten that distance, maybe they haven't considered the environmental side of it, but there's likely something in their daily life, whether they realize it or not. and we in a slightly different context than this, when we work with young people, really any group, sometimes it's, well, I don't have any story to tell. There's nothing interesting in my life, you know, and you're like, no, everybody has something. Okay, well, what did you do yesterday? I don't know. I just made dinner for my family. Oh, you like to cook? You made dinner. It's like, yeah, it was my grandma's recipe. Oh, let's say more about that. Like, oh, well, my grandma came here from Italy and taught us this. You know, like if you just find these small questions that are helping to draw out the information that they don't think is noteworthy, or it's like, oh, this is just my day to day. If something like that could work in your context as you start to make the connection with their daily lives and how they live with these larger issues.
Yeah, I was thinking about something very like progressive, starting with the way you see your neighborhood, and like try to make a drawing as if you were sending it to a friend that lives abroad and wants to know the place where you live, but not in a formal way, but in the way you live it.
Yeah,
I was thinking about something like that, and like going progressive from just like the places that are around you, and then you put down the places where you go often, the places that you like, you don't like, and then just evolve about that, but not ask at the beginning, how do you see the environment?
yeah, no, exactly. And that kind of gets to maybe one of the questions here, you know, like the perspective that is maybe missing. You know, if you were to draw a map of this region, people might put landmarks or historical sites, or maybe here's this restaurant everybody likes, but that might not be the neighborhood you see. You're like, well, I go here, and my friends and I, we meet there, and this is my way. I take the bus to work, things like that. Like it becomes a really personally grounded experience. You could also kind of, as a next step, is like, okay, well, if you were designing your city or designing your neighborhood, what do you think is missing? Like, what would you add? Like, what isn't here, that you as a person who is part of this community feel is there's a gap for, you know?
Yeah, and if I may add just one suggestion or one more question, say you're afraid might not raise enough interest, then what could make this kind of mapping interesting for the people themselves? Because if you say just, well, imagine you're sending this to someone who is far away and would like to know, well, is this going to be the best pitch, or can there be something that is, I think the question, what is missing, for instance, would be a very good question, and drive people to think, oh, what am I missing in my environment?
Yeah, well, the idea was like to start with something that would be kind of like statement of the actual situation. That would be the beginning to reflect what could improve the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a good question.
But, well, this also implies that the person who's like complicated wants to be involved into the neighborhood. Like maybe they could. So
maybe they don't want, but also maybe they feel like they've never had the chance to be invited into it, or that their voice wouldn't really matter too. So, but there might be people who just don't want to be involved, but by offering these different entry points, and sometimes with storytelling, or when we're doing a story and we reach out to people who are maybe a member of that community or have this lived experience, I've sometimes had, oh, why do you want to interview me? I'm nobody. I don't know anything. It's like, well, actually, yes, you do. You are an expert in your experience just as much as, you know, the mayor of that town might be. So I think maybe just helping reframe some of that.
Any other stories or ideas that you want to share, either online or on site?
Yeah, we have just
a few
about
more minutes.
5-6 minutes. Yeah,
Annette,
maybe.
please go
It's
ahead.
really a little try in some minutes
And
and very spontaneous.
there we go.
Thank you.
Okay, there we go. We have sound.
I thought about a subject that intrigues me because of my situation. I am German, firstly German, but also French, and living in France for more than 20 years. And I always, I'm asking myself why it is not possible in France to sell drinking water in glass bottles. other countries have a system with reusable glass bottles, and we regularly have a lot of negative information in France about drinking water in plastic bottles. And I looked at the questions you gave us. The perspective that is overrepresented is research about data about microplastic and the adverse health effects. Everybody knows that, but I feel there is no information about the reasons why it is not possible to have another system. And I think it's a political dimension, probably. It seems to be a lobby problem. And if I had to do a form of storytelling, maybe it could be convincing to make a video to show how, that's my example, in Germany it is possible to have another system and interview people to show how they are organized and why it is possible to drink water in glass bottles. And maybe it could answer to questions for people in France have or doubts that make it very difficult to change the system.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very nice topic, and you can also go for comparative studies because it's between France and Germany. So you would have to interview people both in France and Germany. It would be very rich. I strongly encourage you to do that.
Yeah.
But thank you very much, everybody. It's 28, so we're going to stop here. I thank you for this session, and we'll meet again next week.